Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. We're going to explore how the incredibly rich history of a single nation can actually serve as a masterclass in understanding the broader post-colonial African experience. Welcome, everyone. Today, we are focusing on Cameroon. It's a country sitting right at the hinge of West and Central Africa. But we aren't just going to rattle off dates and facts today. We are tracing the very DNA of modern geopolitical struggles. If you really want to understand the complexities of state building, identity, and resilience across an entire continent, this is absolutely where you need to start.
To make sense of over a century of complex history, we'll follow a quick roadmap. 1. Africa in miniature. 2. The colonial carve-up. 3. The path to independence. 4. Deepening post-colonial fractures. And finally, 5. Navigating contemporary challenges. Let's jump right in.
All right, part 1. Africa in miniature, the pre-colonial era.
This quote right here basically hits the nail on the head. Cameroon epitomizes Africa in miniature. It's a powerful phrase from our source material that just perfectly captures the essence of this country. Whether you're looking at its massive geographical sweep, going from coastal swamps all the way up to towering volcanic mountains, or the fact that it sits at a vibrant cultural crossroads, Cameroon's incredible diversity practically mirrors the entire African continent in one defined space.
And the sheer scale of this pre-colonial diversity is, well, it's honestly staggering. We are talking about over 250 distinct ethnic groups. If we rewind all the way back to around 3000 BC, you had these ancient Bantu migrations spreading from the area of the Nile Lake, moving southward and establishing settlements. For literally thousands of years, these hundreds of self-contained groups coexisted. They adapted to those varied landscapes and built deep, rich linguistic and cultural identities. It was a dynamic, constantly evolving landscape long before the concept of a modern nation-state even existed.
Now back then, the fundamental socio-political unit wasn't a nation-state, it was the clan. And a clan wasn't just, a family tree, it was a comprehensive governance system based on shared ancestry. Authority was vested in councils of elders, chosen specifically for their wisdom and their deep knowledge of history. They managed the land, they settled disputes, and they ensured the welfare of the people. It was a highly sophisticated, localized way of managing community life and resources.
Which brings us to part 2, the colonial carve-up, the era of European annexation.
The whiplash of colonization here happened incredibly fast. It kicks off in 1472 when Portuguese explorers arrived at the Wari River, found a total abundance of crayfish, and quite literally named the region Rio dos Camarões, the River of Prawns. But the real structural shock comes in 1884 when Germany formally annexed the territory, building infrastructure but aggressively exploiting the local resources. Then, right after World War I in 1916, the territory violently changes hands again, with the British and French carving it up as a mandate under the League of Nations. Control shifted from one entirely different European power to another in the blink of an eye.
So the really crucial point here is that this jagged partition between Britain and France didn't just draw an arbitrary line on a map. It forced two completely alien systems of administration onto the region. On one side, the French imposed aggressive assimilation, highly centralized power, and a harsh, direct administration. On the other side, the British went with indirect rule, which was often characterized by comparative administrative neglect. Suddenly, communities with deep, ancient historical ties were forced to operate under entirely conflicting legal, educational, and cultural philosophies, and that laid down deeply ingrained fractures we still see today.
Moving along to part 3, the path to independence, a very rocky road.
The struggle for self-rule was by no means an overnight success. By the 1940s, specifically starting around 1941 with groups like the UPC, and into the 50s, you had these powerful nationalist movements heavily mobilizing across both French and British territories. But when independence finally arrived in the early 60s, it was a mess. It was deeply entangled in global Cold War rivalries and the nearly impossible, frankly bungled task of merging two fundamentally different colonial legacies into one single federal republic.
So that leaves us with the million-dollar question. How exactly did a hard-fought independence lead to a deeply fractured polity? I want you to really think about that, because understanding the flawed execution of this reunification is the skeleton key to unlocking Cameroon's modern struggles. The people fought heroically for the right to rule themselves, but the structural foundations they inherited were effectively rigged against a smooth transition. That leads us into part 4, deepening post-colonial fractures, where we hit the harsh economic realities. For a brief shining moment, things looked incredibly promising, nearly $5,000. To put that into perspective, that number represents the peak per capita income during a massive oil boom in 1981.
It was a time of profound optimism. The country was experiencing diversified economic growth, pouring heavy investments into infrastructure and education, and seeing the rapid emergence of a prosperous urban middle class. It truly felt like Cameroon was positioning itself to be an absolute economic powerhouse in the region.
But then, just 5 years later, bam, the devastating 1986 crash hits. Dropping global oil prices and a mountain of heavy debt completely derailed the economy. This plunged what was once the most resource-rich country in the region into deep, severe economic stagnation. The government was suddenly forced to rely on foreign structural adjustment programs, which were often dictated by external institutions requiring strict macro policies and rapid privatizations. According to our sources, these programs often place precious resources cheaply in the hands of exploiters, which just deepened the economic crisis even further.
And while the economy is tanking, the social fabric is completely tearing apart. This forceful merging of totally incompatible colonial systems created a massive crisis of identity. You had a Francophone legacy of centralized civil law, clashing directly with an Anglophone legacy of common law that increasingly felt marginalized, almost like it had been annexed. This division severed ancient kinship ties and brewed a volatile concoction of resentment, making any sense of national unity incredibly difficult to achieve.
And that brings us up to Part 5, Navigating Contemporary Challenges, the Modern-Day Crises. Today, all those historical fractures we just talked about, they've erupted into very real, very complex crises. The legacy of that World War I partition is quite literally fueling the ongoing Anglophone crisis, an armed struggle deeply rooted in those historical feelings of marginalization. Meanwhile, in the north, the country is battling the regional Boko Haram insurgency. On top of that, civil society organizations report significant ongoing concerns regarding human rights, freedom of assembly, and state repression. And running right through the middle of all of this is a system of endemic political patronage that severely hampers effective governance.
Economically, the picture is just as messy. Despite having immense natural wealth and that historic oil boom we discussed, the vital oil sector today actually accounts for less than 12% of the GDP. The vast majority of the economy is heavily leaning on agriculture and other sectors. The potential for massive growth is definitely there, but systemic corruption and inefficiencies at various levels of governance lead to huge revenue losses and prevent that wealth from actually trickling down to benefit the broader population.
Compounding all of these political and economic headaches are some truly serious environmental threats. The country's dealing with unsustainable timber exploitation, the poaching of endangered species, and totally unregulated agricultural expansion for things like cocoa. And what makes this even worse is a weak bureaucratic capacity for sustainable management. Decision-making is rarely participatory, and declining state funding for conservation means that the incredible ancient biodiversity we mentioned at the very start of this explainer is under severe, immediate threat.
Which really brings us to a critical realization. We can't just slap a Band-Aid on this. Mere policy tweaks aren't going to cut it. Sustainable development here requires a complete ground-up paradigm shift in how power is viewed and shared. It means finally moving past those exploitative colonial legacies of centralized power and returning to systems that prioritize equity, transparency, and the well-being of all citizens.
So I'm going to leave you with this to ponder. If arbitrary lines drawn on a map in Europe can spark a century of conflict, what fundamental shifts are required to finally build a truly unified African miniature? The story certainly isn't over yet. Understanding Cameroon's past is absolutely crucial to unlocking its future potential. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep looking at the bigger picture, and I'll catch you next time.